Welcome to Haggy Reads for You on Wolf Spirit Radio. Colleen, her Haggy, reads children's stories for the wee ones up to the teens. She also reads books for grown-ups. Tune in, kick back, relax, and listen in. You're listening to Wolf Spirit Radio.
Hi everyone, this is Colleen, and today I'm back with the 9/11 Crusade by Nancy L. Hopkins, and I'm going to pick up where I left off last week. The U.S. Department of Defense began development of GPS in 1973 to enhance navigation. Instead of land-based transmitters, 24 satellites would be used. Congress agreed to fund the massive project because of the Cold War military navigation by submarines and aircraft, with missiles and the missiles themselves. The first GPS satellite was launched in 1989, and the 24th in 1994. By September 2001, GPS navigation was providing civilian aircraft precision of 65 feet. But in addition, the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, augmented the GPS system with the Wide Area Augmentation System, or WAAS, to obtain even greater precision. WAAS used ground-based stations composed of reference stations monitoring GPS signals and master stations. Measurements from reference stations are forwarded to a master station that analyzes small variations in GPS satellite signals due to atmospheric and other causes. That analysis results in a correction message being sent to geostationary WAAS satellites. These satellites then broadcast the corrected signal to aircraft to obtain even more accuracy. By December 1999, WAAS signals were being transmitted from WAAS satellites for testing purposes. By September 2001, aircraft equipped with WAAS receivers could hit a target within 6 feet horizontally by 10 feet vertically. Each of the twin towers was 208 feet wide. The highway in the sky has also been developed during the 1990s. Using the concept of waypoints merged with GPS and WAAS technology, aircraft began flying inside virtual tunnels. Navigational signals, defined corridors, and onboard electronic systems guided aircraft to fly within those navigational corridors. The corridors had become exact and narrow with introduction of the WAAS signals. By 2001, these virtual tunnels never varied more than half the wingspan of a Boeing 737. Waypoints can be fly over or fly by, and are simply coordinates of 3 dimensions. The twin towers themselves occupied waypoint coordinates. To electronically hijack an airliner and fly it into the twin towers was not that difficult. All that was needed was a command, making the tower's waypoint coordinate a termination instead of a flyby or flyover. Morris believed advances in navigation would make it obvious the proposed attack plan could be done without use of pilots. Just a month after 9/11/2001, Cubic Defense Systems, Incorporated, applied for a patent on an anti-hijacking system capable of deactivating the onboard flight controls and remotely taking over control of a hijacked aircraft. It would simply take activation of a panic button by the flight crew. While there was no panic button on aircraft in 2001, there was a system in place that could be used as a substitute. In case of a hijacking, pilots were trained to punch in 4 numbers that would add to the transponder's code a warning on the ground radar screen. Next to the radar blip on the screens, the letters HJCK would be added. On 9/11/2001, none of the flight control centers received the hijack signal from any of the 4 hijacked planes. The flight crews did punch in the codes, but by then the code was linked to the anti-hijack system that had been secretly installed in their aircraft. Pilots John Oganowski, pilot Victor Saracini, and pilot Chick Burlingame all sent the code only to realize that they had lost complete control over the aircraft. Pilot Jason Dahl on United 93 appeared to have entered the code as the transponder stopped working, but something failed. The hijackers ended up really flying his plane into the ground in Pennsylvania. Jimmy was looking out the window and at the ocean. He just shook his head, still amazed the obvious had gone unnoticed by all the media sources that should have screamed bullshit. Dan Carlin believed no one would question Arab hijackers as pilots. Carlin had been right, and that pissed Morris off. Still, Jimmy believed it was only a matter of time before the truth come out. Someday, someone would point out the obvious. But by then, it will not matter, Jimmy thought. The telephone began ringing. A moment later, Jimmy was listening to Brad Taylor's voice. "Sir, we have the satellite focused on target. The occupants are assumed to be inside a restaurant. I am linking to you now." As he started staring at Sid's car parked outside the IHOP, Jimmy was still trying to figure out what to do with Sid. It was Carlin who ordered all civilians killed. Jimmy did not realize that order included Sid. Initially, they were going to keep Sid alive in case they needed someone to explain installation of the demolition system as a worst-case scenario. Jimmy guessed that after FEMA's May 2002 report explaining how fires weakened the towers resulting in the pancaking collapse, with no mention of a deliberate demolition, Carlin decided Sid was no longer needed alive. Morris smiled, thinking, shame about the skiing accident Carlin had. Carlin had died in July while skiing in Argentina. The telephone connection to Brad Taylor was still active, and the phone was on speaker. It was Taylor's voice that made Sid focus on the computer screen and the white Cherokee. "Got action," Taylor said. Jimmy was also looking at 3 people who had left the restaurant and quickly got into the Jeep. "Send a still photo," Morris ordered. A minute later, Jimmy was studying the 3 figures. Sid and Nellie, and "Who the hell is that other guy?" Jimmy said aloud. Taylor responded, "Checking it now. The baseball cap is not allowing for facial recognition. I'm pulling the girl's telephone records." A few minutes later, "Sir, it looks like she's not used her phone since yesterday. The last telephone call she received was from a Martin Martin." "You're kidding me. Martin Martin?" "Yes, sir. Pulling his file now." "Ah, tagged as moderate threat. Seems to be a computer expert. Sister killed in Pentagon 9/11. Has a website." Checking. The website's mostly concerned with victims and their families. It's what they're calling blogs. People talking to themselves. Really rather large website. Send me what you have on him and dig some more. Keep him under surveillance. Yes, sir. Backing out now. Taylor ordered the satellite to zoom out to better track the Cherokee. By the time the satellite reset, the Cherokee was at the edge of the parking lot. Jimmy watched it carefully drive to the gas station across the street. At the corner of the lot, the car stopped, and the driver got out. Jimmy knew it was Sid, and a moment later he realized his brother was at the tire inflation pump. Sid slowly checked and filled each tire. As he was doing this, he ran through the steps Marty had detailed. He got back in the car and drove over to the pumps under the canopy. No sooner had he pulled up than a white Ford Taurus drove up to the other side of the pumps, facing the opposite direction. All three occupants got out of the Cherokee as the driver of the Taurus got out. The man chose one of the nozzles and looked to be starting the pump. Sid had left his car door open and was putting the nozzle of gas he normally used into his car, but did not set it to pump. The stranger who was about to take his car would know which gas it took. Sid tried not to think about leaving his old four-wheeled friend. Instead, he left the pump nozzle in and walked over to the Taurus side of the pump, where he pretended to be pumping fuel into the Ford. The rental was already full of gas. Marty, meanwhile, had positioned himself between the back passenger doors of both cars. As the driver moved by him, the driver said in a muffled voice, "Love you, man." Both momentarily stopped and looked at each other. Marty made a shallow, affirmative nod, and unexpected emotions choked him up. The driver continued over to the Cherokee's pump and put in a credit card. Marty opened the back door of the Taurus and immediately turned to get the first bags Nellie was taking out of the Cherokee. As he turned to put the bags in the Taurus, Marty looked toward the front passenger seat as he heard a woman say, "Hi, Marty." It was Anita, his sister Jill's partner. The lump in his throat suddenly broke forth in a sob. Just one sob before he caught himself. Anita reached over the seat, and Marty took her hand with a loving squeeze. Marty knew he might never see either of his friends again. He let go of her hand and took the next bundles from Nellie. Softly he said, "I love you. Be safe. Dump the car sooner than later." Anita replied, "Love you too. You be safe." Her eyes were filled with tears. A few moments later, the last of the bags were transferred. Anita moved into the Ford's driver's seat. As Nellie walked around the Taurus to get into the front seat of the passenger side, Anita got out and swiftly moved across to the Jeep and its open driver door. She slid over the Cherokee's driver's seat into the passenger seat. From there, she and Marty shared loving stares and tear-filled eyes. A few moments later, Marty was in the back seat of the Taurus. Sid soon joined them as the driver of the new car. A few minutes later, the Taurus slowly drove out from under the overhang and onto Lehigh Street, southbound. As Anita watched them drive away, she pulled out the latex gloves and put one set on. She also put on the shirt that Nellie'd been wearing. By the time Tim got into the car, Anita had Sid's green shirt, the baseball cap, and the other pair of latex gloves ready for him. "Anita, are you sure the gloves are necessary?" "Yes," she said, holding a cloth and getting out of the car to move around to where Tim had just been pumping gas. Unobtrusively, she wiped down the Cherokee's fuel door and the surrounding area. When she got back in the car, she handed the cloth to Tim. "Clean off anything you've touched before you got the gloves on." Tim softly cursed. Anita laughed. "Look, we don't know what Marty's gotten into. I think it's prudent to at least keep our fingerprints to ourselves. What is it Marty says? Rather safe than stupid, Tim replied. Yeah, rather safe than stupid. When the green shirt and baseball cap were on, Tim then struggled with the gloves. Dang, but these are tight. No one will notice them. I will. I hate these things. Just drive. If it's the only thing bothering you at the end of the journey, we'll both be very happy. Jimmy did not really notice the white sedan leave the gas station. He was waiting for the Jeep. He watched the Cherokee pull out and onto Lehigh Street and move back toward Route 178. After it was on the highway heading west, Jimmy started looking at the file Taylor had sent him on Martin. Taylor was right. There was not much in the file on Marty. Jimmy decided to check out Marty's website. Day 2. Interstate 81. They were back on Interstate 78 and had traveled a few miles before anyone said anything. Finally Sid commented, I've never been so nervous about getting gas. Nellie's voice carried her anxiety. Hell yes, that was wild. Who were those people, Marty? The guy's name is Tim Bartlett. He's like one of my oldest friends. The woman is Anita, my sister's partner. Marty's voice was full of sadness. Nellie turned around to look at him in the back seat. It was rather cramped with all their gear and Marty. You okay? Not really. Sid replied, Gee, Marty. It all seemed to go so well. What are you worried about? I'm afraid for them. Now they're the target. Sid glanced in the rear-view mirror at Marty, who was slumped down and just staring out the side window. I didn't think about that, Sid noted with embarrassment. What will they do now? They should be behind us. They'll keep traveling west. The scenario calls for them to just keep moving in the direction that we were traveling. Somewhere, they have a point at which they'll dump the Cherokee. The longer they go, the safer we are, and the more dangerous it becomes for them. Sooner or later, the bad guys will try to stop them. When they find out we're not in the car, well, Marty did not finish his thoughts. He really did not know what would happen. I'm hoping they will not play heroes and just dump the car before they get apprehended. Nellie asked, Is Anita into computer gaming with the rest of you? Since 9/11, yes. She's partially driven my obsession to uncover the truth. Anita is not a computer geek. She was so hurt and lost over Jill's death. I thought it'd be good therapy to bring her aboard. Now she's something she can do. Like I suspect, Anita was the one to find that gas station in the IHOP. Each scenario has certain basic structures and a lot of variable details. This escape scenario has a host of versions. Anita took it and worked details depending upon locations. Allentown is central to the number of our members. Sid asked, How many members do you have? To be honest, I'm not exactly sure. We operate similar to terrorists with cells scattered across the United States. We have been doing this before anyone was concerned about Al-Qaeda. It was all a harmless, if complicated game in the beginning. When we were kids, really. As we got older, the world got nuttier. We began to think in terms of real-world enemies, and to fear the game might become much more than just a game. It was the Oklahoma bombing that changed everything. One of the group had a father working at the Murrah Federal Building as an ATF inspector. The father was warned not to show up for work on the day of the bombing. Nellie snapped. What? Well, I can't confirm that ATF inspectors were warned not to go to work that day. I had no reason to doubt my friend or his dad. And no ATF field agent was even wounded in the bombing that was supposed to target them. When questioned about this miraculous survival of all their agents, ATF provided a tale of heroism by one of their agents. They claimed a guy named Macaulay was in an elevator at the time the bomb went off. Supposedly, he managed to escape from the elevator and then helped others out of the building. Problem was, the elevators were all found empty with the doors open. The elevator company said that there was no way the ATF story could be true. Thus, their substantial proof, ATF, blatantly lied. It was one of numerous lies concerning the bombing, made by every government agency that became involved. The more we looked, the worse it got. There's television video of locals dealing with at least 2 additional unexploded bombs. There are numerous links to accomplices that are of Arab descent and linked to Iraq. Neither extra bombs nor Arabs were allowed to be introduced during the Timothy McVeigh trial. The government wanted us to accept it was another homegrown terrorist, acting with a few other homegrown accomplices. By then, most of us were not surprised by blatant lies and either incompetency or cover-up by government agencies. By then, we weren't happy campers. Some were way more paranoid than others. Some just thought it added realism to the game. Some thought the rest of us were crazy, and over time, they dropped out of the group. Sid surmised. So over the years, you came across computer nerds who joined together to create and play computer games. Then you migrated into believing in conspiracies. Then you started building actual scenarios to be used if your paranoia turned out to be based upon reality. Yup, that's the way it happened. And you met all these people because your dad was in the military, and you moved around a lot? In the beginning, yes. But with the Internet, the group really took off. The main group totals 17. Each of them has an inner group whom they trust implicitly. The inner group is comprised of people who each of the 17 know personally. And each has an expanded group, who are kept in the game but at a distance. Those are the ones that come from the Internet. Those are the ones we basically cannot afford to trust. They're only playing games. We're positioning ourselves to react to whatever comes next. Marty noticed a sign and requested, "Sid, let's stop at the rest stop. I need to clear out enough space to lie down. I'm just beat." Sid guided the car off I-78 and into the rest stop area. They'd all gotten out of the car to reorganize. Sid was standing at the rear of the car as Marty reached out to open the trunk. For whatever reason, Sid looked toward the highway in time to see the Cherokee go by. He nudged Marty and pointed toward the Cherokee. The 2 men stared as it grew smaller. "Love you guys. Be safe," Marty thought. Sid was thinking of all the amazing times he had had with his Cherokee. Nellie come up to him and saw them both just staring off into space. "What's the problem?" she asked, wondering why they'd not yet opened the trunk. "Anita and Tim just went by," Marty replied. He continued opening the trunk. "Wow," Sid said as he looked inside. A large plastic cooler greeted him. Marty pulled it out and took it to the side of the car. It should be full of food and drinks. Anita's something else. We'll keep this up front. Sid noted, "Yes, she is. There's a blanket and a pillow in here, too." Nellie added, "Marty, you'll get comfortable now." It did not take long to clear out the rear passenger seat and put most things in the trunk. After opening the cooler, and pulling out some drinks, the three companions were soon back on the road. Sid took Nellie up on her offer to drive. As the Cherokee drove by the rest area, Tim saw Marty and Sid. "Hey, Anita." "There they are," as he pointed out the window. While saying nothing, both had the same thoughts of love and the fear they might never see Marty again. Anita watched for as long as she could see him. She'd been studying her notebook with maps and notations, and soon went back to it without saying a word. "What are you thinking?" Tim asked. "I think we can give 'em 5 hours if we dump the Jeep at the Pittsburgh airport. Just after Harrisburg, we'll take I-76. There are tolls, but it's only 282 miles. If the note's right, and the Cherokee's getting 16 miles per gallon, we might be able to make it without a gas stop." "Taking a plane?" "No. They have buses that run every 20 minutes to a dozen locations. We'll just take the first bus to wherever and work our way to a car rental location." "Sounds like a plan," Tim noted. From his command center office, Brad Taylor kept an eye on the satellite image of the white Cherokee. It was continuing westward on I-78 at a moderate speed, and would soon intersect and merge with I-81. With its darkened windows, Taylor would not be able to see inside the car with the current satellite. If James Morris was right and it continued on I-81 and moved south, there was no way to see inside the car. Taylor just had to carefully monitor it until it stopped and the passengers again got out. Morris seemed convinced his brother was headed toward North Carolina. Taylor wondered why Morris would be chasing his brother. Taylor got involved in another project, and a good 90 minutes went by before the Cherokee got his full attention again. He put in a call to Morris. "Sir, he indicated the Cherokee would take I-81 south toward North Carolina, but it just left I-81 and is continuing west on I-78. Jimmy'd been annoyed at the interruption until he heard Taylor's news. He'd been sure Sid was going to North Carolina, and for some reason, Jimmy still felt that. So what was the Cherokee doing going west? Can you reconfirm identity of the passengers?" "No, sir. The windows are tinted. If they keep moving west, the next satellite could be positioned to take a close shot through the windshield. If the sun and clouds are favorable, we should be able to see right inside the vehicle." "How long?" "Rough guess, 3 hours. What's the weather look like?" "Partly cloudy, but I think we can work it." "Keep tracking and set up the satellite. Taylor, access ground support, but do nothing yet." "Yes, sir." Jimmy'd been reading Marty Martin's website. He really wanted to stop reading the entries of family members and friends of those who had died on 9/11. It was all getting too emotional, yet Jimmy could not stop. It was as if he needed to punish himself. He had never seen this type of website. People were just telling stories by writing on a website. It was like a huge group of people swapping stories, as humans had done forever. But instead of hanging around the campfire, they were putting it out for the whole world to experience, electronically. It did not take long to understand how dangerous this type of dialogue could be. Some of Morris's associates had tried to explain the dangers, but Morris and others had not paid any attention. He realized that they had underestimated both the power of the Internet and the need for people to communicate and possibly organize around this type of website. Half of the writings were just about people talking about their lost loves. Half was about the multitude of questions regarding what the government had said happened. Jimmy had started with the conspiracy writings. He grew to admire the way Martin handled some of the very lunatic theories. One after another, theories that were flawed were analyzed and dismissed by Martin. What was bothersome was Martin's obvious refusal to discuss theories that were actually very accurate. While Martin was careful not to let out what he really thought, the lack of commenting indicated to Jimmy that Martin knew way too much. Sid's death had been ordered by Jimmy's boss, and without Jimmy knowing it. Even after Dan Carlin's sudden death and Jimmy taking over Carlin's position, the fact Sid was on an eradication list was not seen by Jimmy. Thankfully, the murder attempt had failed. Now Jimmy had full control over the fate of his brother and niece. If Martin was not in the picture, Jimmy would probably tell Taylor to shut down the operation. The fact explosives were in the towers appeared to be a known fact on the Internet. Sid could add little to the discussion. He posed no real danger. Martin was another thing. The wise thing to do was order the Cherokee and its occupants apprehended. But doing so would complicate things. Complications meant less control. For having spent his life as a control freak who never doubted his own abilities, Jimmy had spent the last year in a spiral of self-doubt. Jimmy had started reading Martin's website section about the people. He found it amazingly compelling. He decided to put off making a decision and continue reading. Marty was soundly sleeping in the back seat. Nellie was driving somewhat faster than Sid would be doing. It forced him to remember the first time he took her out for a driving lesson. It was the last time for Sid. After that, Sarah was the teacher. Sid could just not handle the fact that his daughter was becoming an adult way too fast for him. Now she was an adult, and Sid decided not to comment on her driving. He could not help himself. "You seem to have the same heavy foot your mother has." Nellie looked at him with a sideward glance of disapproval. "You want to drive?" Nope. I was just making a comment." "Dad, I'm having a blast. I can't remember the last time I was driving and on a highway." "Yes!" "Well, see, in the city you haven't been practicing, and you might just want to slow down some." This time Nellie laughed and said, "Chill, Dad. I know you're grown up, but there's just something about you driving that I find unnerving. You're always gonna be my little girl." Sid accentuated the word little. "Not so little anymore," Nellie commented. "No, I guess we're all just moving down the road of life," Sid replied. They were quiet for a while. Finally Sid said, "Jimmy wasn't the first death, but he was so young. The fact he was my twin shook me to the core. I had to confront my own life expectancy. I was going along without really thinking about getting old. You know, death is what awaits us all, but mostly for old people, unless you're a soldier." Nellie glanced at her dad. It was the first reference she'd heard him make about being a soldier. Her mom had told her not to question her dad about his experience in Vietnam. It was a forbidden topic. Nellie wondered if, after all this time, he needed to talk about it. She could see he was deep in thought. "You fought in Vietnam, didn't you, Dad?" "Yes." Nellie just waited to see if he would open up. Finally she prodded with, "What was it like?" "Hell," he immediately replied. "How so?" Sid took his time replying. "It was a combination of things. We were all so naive." The draft was on, and Jimmy got drafted. We talked to the Army recruiter who promised us that if we enlisted, we could be stationed together. The recruiter was a liar. No sooner than we got out of basic training, Jimmy went one way and I went the other. I was sent to ordnance school, and he was sent to work in intelligence. What set you apart? Jimmy was always smarter than I was, but he was also a smart-ass. We were both convinced to enlist under the Direct Commission Officer program. Our college degrees got us into the program, so our basic training really entailed learning how to be an officer. Right from the get-go, Jimmy was irritating officers trying to train us. He was always full of himself, arrogant, and a know-it-all. Guess that was what they were looking for in the intelligence community. Or maybe they thought he would not be able to cut it in any other spot. I think they were right. He would not have survived in Vietnam. How so? You had to be a team player. You had to take orders, even those you thought were crazy. And there were a lot of those. You had to sometimes take orders from someone who was totally incompetent, or just a simple asshole. Jimmy would have gotten himself fragged. What's that mean? Fragging is killing a superior officer with a grenade. But over the years, it didn't necessarily entail using a grenade. Jimmy was just so arrogant, he wouldn't have gotten the respect of the troops. And some of those troops would not have hesitated killing him. Even as kids, Jimmy's arrogance was obvious. Mom had us join up for a minor league, which is the prelude to Little League baseball. Jimmy would cry if he could not pitch, and he was not good at that. He didn't take long to quit, and that was the pattern of his life. If he didn't excel, he didn't play. I know you and Mom think that of him, but I always had fun with Uncle Jimmy. Oh, he's a charmer for sure. What about you? What was it like to be an officer? I wasn't a good officer by Army standards. I was just one of the guys. I wore the rank but didn't play the game. I just wanted to do whatever it took to get my guys back home. I know they respected me for that. My superiors saw me as a pain in the ass. I seldom hung out with the other officers and made it a point to do whatever it took to keep us out of direct combat. That's not to say I was always successful at that. Sid's voice trailed off as bad memories flooded in. It was hell, Nellie. Young men died and young men were converted into hateful things. I was less directly involved in most of it. But you'd hear the stories, awful stories. War is inhumane, and there is no reason under the sun to take that road. Was it the war that pushed you and Uncle Jimmy apart? It started over Jimmy bragging about how they could listen in on radio transmissions from Viet Cong troops. But we had to add that they could not tell anyone in the field that they could do it. Jimmy admitted to letting American troops be ambushed in order to protect the secret that they were able to listen to enemy radio. He went into this justification of protecting the secrets, and he didn't seem to give a damn that the soldiers died because they were not warned. Jimmy called him collateral damage. To me, there's something very wrong when a secret is worth more than soldiers' lives. But Jimmy just kept pointing to collateral damage being a necessity of war. It was not just what happened to the American troops. I saw devastation in Vietnam perpetrated against the civilian population and the entire country. I came back and worked in the anti-war movement. Jimmy had stayed in the States in some higher place and never really felt the war. He saw it as a great necessity for national security. I saw it as madness. We could not get beyond these opposite positions. It was easier to just stay away from each other. I would have let it be, but Jimmy couldn't keep from trying to sway me to his vision, anti-patriotic. And I think he began thinking of me as the enemy. He certainly hated all the rest of those protesting the war. So yeah, the war drove us apart. What brought you back together? Time. When your grandmother was alive, we made a point of getting together for either Thanksgiving or Christmas. After she died, we knew we'd have to work at a relationship. We made a point of calling at least once a month. Then Jimmy brought me into the tower project, and it was like we were kids again. Only once did we get back into the old argument, but Jimmy realized it was a dead issue. What exactly did Jimmy do? I realized I don't know what Uncle Jimmy did for a living. That's because he'd never talk about it. I honestly am not sure what he did. He stayed with the Army and eventually got to the rank of light colonel before retiring. But it seemed like the Army gig was a cover for something else. He just seemed to be doing things in places that wouldn't have been a typical Army job. If I had to guess, I'd guess he was into some black ops stuff. Like what? Don't know. It's just a feeling. When we were kids, we had a high degree of knowing what the other was feeling and often thinking. That closeness faded over the years, but some of it was still there. Plus his wife claimed he was in black ops. And you'd believe that drunk? Nellie laughed. Sid laughed back before replying. She did like to drink, but maybe he drove her to it. Jimmy was seldom home, and yet for a decade he had her moving every couple of years. Finally, she told him she wasn't going to play the Army wife anymore. They stuck it out until Jenny was 16. But by then, they'd been long separated. I don't think Jimmy saw Linda after they divorced. Have you, or do you know what happened to her? I could not believe she didn't attend Uncle Jimmy's funeral. She was out of the country, but your mom has kept in touch and had kept in touch. The last I heard, Linda'd stopped drinking and was married to a preacher. A preacher? Nellie responded with surprise. Yeah, Sarah said she wasn't sure which came first, religion or abstinence. Sarah actually went to the wedding. She said the preacher was delightful, and Linda appeared happy and lucky. Oh, that's right. I was actually invited also, but that was when I went to Asia with Shelley. If you remember, Mom was not happy about that Asian trip. She thought it was too dangerous. She's the first person I remember talking about terrorists. She made me so mad, I said some things that I shouldn't have said. Like what? Like I basically called her a crackpot. Been there, done that. She was the first one ranting about the Oklahoma bombing being a cover-up, and that there were Arabs involved. She and Marty both share Oklahoma that seemed to radicalize their thoughts. Crap, Nellie. Your mom was radicalized when she was 15, and they assassinated President Kennedy. She never got over that. Never mind anything else. I think she was born a radical. A lovable radical, but, like you said, a crackpot nonetheless. Sid started laughing as he said, You couldn't remember this, but when you were a baby, she would read to you from those conspiracy books. I come home one night and she was in your room reading to you. I thought how nice it was until I realized what she was reading. It had something to do with Lee Harvey Oswald. Sid was really laughing now. Nellie joined him. Oh, Dad, it was not just when I was a baby. I can remember her coming into my bedroom carrying one of those thick books. Nellie was fueling Sid's and her own laughter. Thing was, it did the trick. I'd fall asleep immediately. The two had to calm it down because they could hear Marty reacting to their loud laughter. They were waking him up, and because they should not, the two were getting into uncontrolled giggles. Partially to sober them up, Nellie said, "But, Dad, the crackpot might have been right all along. After 9/11 happened, I started researching and looking at conspiracy theories. I have to say there's an enormous amount of information out there on all sorts of bizarre things. I think some of my friends are thinking I'm a crackpot. But Mom taught me not to push my ideas on others. That's why I so treasure Marty's friendship. We can share knowledge that others just dismiss. And of course, Mom and I have become really close in the last year. I actually apologized to her for calling her a crackpot. Last spring, I spent 2 weeks with her, and she gave me an amazing tour of bizarro reality. The Internet is just filled with websites after website, discussing everything from Earth colonies on Mars to weather warfare. Since then, I've continued to research, and it just keeps growing. I've a newfound admiration for Mom." Sid softly agreed. "I know what you mean. You miss her, don't you?" "More than you can know. She was my best friend since high school. In the last year, I've questioned what went wrong. Was it just her radical thoughts or something more? Oh, there was a lot more. We were still friends, but not lovers. The gulf had gotten too wide. I think it happens with any couple. The romance had long gone. She claimed I was turning into an old man. I just wanted to live quietly with the four-leggeds in the mountains. I wondered what she thought we were going to do with the cabin. And building that cabin was a real strain. She saw one thing, and I saw something much simpler. She was beginning to hate living out in the country, away from civilization, with an old man and his pets. Well, I for one loved that old man, Nellie said while reaching out to squeeze Sid's arm. She said I was just sitting around waiting to die. Were you? Not in my mind. I didn't have to work for money, and I didn't have anything that really interested me in the work world. But I do like fishing, and just being there in those mountains. In my view, I was really living life to the fullest, because I didn't have to deal with work and worry. Sounds like she thought you were boring. She said that to you, didn't she? Okay, yes, she did. But the upside is you're not boring now. Now you're at the center of a massive conspiracy, and the bad guys are chasing you. I think you and Mom have a chance of making a go of it. You'll definitely be her hero. Not much of a hero when she realizes that I was the one who planted explosives in the towers. Dad, did you also plant explosives in Building 7? You mean the Solomon Brothers building? Yes. No, why? Well, that building also collapsed. What? Sid asked with surprise. Jimmy's office was in that building. Nellie momentarily looked at her dad while thinking about her uncle. It collapsed in the afternoon. Why? Supposedly, debris from the North Tower started fires that devastated the building and it collapsed. Well, now that's interesting. You're saying in a single day, fire took down 3 steel buildings, which had almost never happened before. Nellie replied, and also interesting were the tenants. There was the Department of Defense, the CIA, the IRS, the Office of New York City's Emergency Management, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Secret Service. You would think that they'd work hard to save a building with those kind of tenants, wouldn't you? Nellie had a thought and asked, Dad, do you know if Uncle Jimmy's office was part of the New York City's emergency center? I don't know. As I remember, he was on the 18th floor. How bad was the fire? Nobody seems clear on that. Any photos I've seen show a small fire on one floor, but no quantity of smoke coming out of the building. One report said something about water being limited due to water mains being broken. But the building's only a couple blocks from the Hudson River. I would find it more plausible if it was some building that didn't have such high-profile tenants, and they didn't have the manpower to fight the fire. And there's no doubt it was controlled demolition. There's video of it, and it fell right into its footprint. It was a controlled demolition, and no one is really disputing that fact. It's just a mystery as to why it all had to be destroyed. What's most amazing is the collapse of the building was reported by the BBC before it actually went down. Marty showed me a video clip he got from an American in England who had recorded the television coverage of what was happening in the U.S. The video shows two BBC newscasters talking about its collapse with a BBC reporter in New York. Building 7 can still be seen intact. The New York reporter just happened to be standing in front of a window with a view of Building 7. Moments before the building actually did collapse, the New York image begins to break up and then just cuts out completely. Sid laughed. Totally absurd. Marty's voice startled him. What time is it? Sid looked at his watch and said, Oh, shit! And he also looked at the gas gauge and saw it was almost on empty. Nellie realized what was happening and said, The next exit is less than a mile away. Not to panic. I've been watching the gauge. Well? Marty asked again. What time is it? Sid replied, 3:35. Marty noted, Wow, I've been asleep for what, 2 hours? Nellie corrected, More like over 2.5 hours, but Marty, you never slept last night. That's what I mean. It's only that long, and I really feel good. It was writings of the 10-year-old daughter of a Pentagon victim that unleashed the torrent of tears. Jimmy could not turn it off, and had just succumbed to the emotional breakdown. James Morris could not remember crying before. He had teared up before, like at his mom's funeral. But since he was a child, Jimmy had never cried before. Without Brad Taylor's call, Jimmy did not know how long he would have been crying. He just let the phone ring. Took him 10 minutes before he could handle calling Taylor back. Sir, the satellite is in position, and the target will be coming into range within the next hour. Weather looks doable. We have locals that can get into position within that time frame. What would you like to do? Jimmy thought nothing. Out loud he said, Let's just confirm the occupants, nothing more. And Jimmy hung up. Jimmy just sat in the overstuffed leather chair and looked out the window. He was absolutely drained. He had never experienced such uncontrolled emotion. It was like everything in the past year had suddenly grabbed him and shook him and tore away all vestiges of control. James Morris was currently unable to make a decision of any sort. His mind just wanted to shut down, and he closed his eyes. I need a nap, he thought, and almost immediately he fell asleep. On September 11, 2001, James Morris was in his command center in 7 World Trade Center, also known as the Solomon Brothers Building. The timing of the planned event was dictated by satellite positions. The hijacking attacks required absolute electronic precision flying. To acquire that level of perfection, the GPS/WAAS satellites would provide the required navigational control. The more satellites, the more accuracy. They planned backwards from the satellite coverage. They had a window where 14 to 15 satellites would be visible, providing a maximum coverage for navigation. They then determined which long-range flights coming out of Boston would be taking off in time to make it to New York to fit into the window. The window was only 15 minutes. Initially, they would have settled for any aircraft flying near or toward New York City. But they realized they could get maximum effect if the aircraft were heavily loaded with fuel. An aircraft flying to California would fit that description. Luckily, they had 2 California-bound aircraft scheduled to take off from Boston that could make the 15-minute window in New York City. One was American Airlines Flight 11, and the other was United Flight 175. They planned for maximum satellite coverage because it was something they could count on. Weather was another story. Clouds could produce navigational errors, while fewer satellites could deliver acceptable navigational parameters in a cloudy atmosphere for aircraft with pilots or with targets much less narrowly defined. The goal was to plow 2 aircraft into the center of each of the twin towers without a pilot. James Morris was ecstatic that morning. The weather was pristine clear. He'd been promised it would be clear, and it was. It was no longer absolutely critical the airliners take off on time. Morris had some wiggle room. The mission could be completed with fewer satellites, simply because of the crystal-clear skies. Jimmy thought, the weather gods are smiling upon us. James Morris sat waiting. He was in communication with Brad Taylor through a wireless earpiece. Taylor had told Morris when AA-11 took off, and James was calculating how long it would take for the hijacking to occur. Morris was starting to get concerned when the call came in from Brad Taylor. System engaged. AA-11 was being hijacked. Its pilot punched in the hijacking code into the transponder beacon system. Taylor had received the signal from AA-11 indicating a hijack was in progress. The pilot had been trying to warn ground controllers. He did not know the code sent out a signal in a frequency the FAA ground controllers would not see. Brad Taylor saw it. A moment later he confirmed to James Morris, "Sir, we have control." When the hijack code was punched in, a signal was broadcasted that only Brad Taylor's group received. It was like a knock on a door, followed by the door being opened. An automatic reply sent an entirely new set of electronic parameters through the door. AA-11 could no longer communicate normally, nor be controlled manually, and the automatic flight system data was replaced with new information. The aircraft was automatically turned to intersect an electronic virtual tunnel system. AA-11 was on a pre-selected route, being controlled by the automatic flight system that was continually connected to the GPS WAAS satellites, providing exact navigational data. Taylor did not have direct control over AA-11. The aircraft was flying itself. They did not have to do much to the aircraft at all. Since 1998, All Boeing 757s and 767 aircraft owned by the American Airlines and United Airlines were upgraded with the Pegasus. The Pegasus flight management system was designed to fly virtual tunnels using the waypoint route concept. The Twin Towers were located on one of those waypoints. The Rockwell Collins multi-mode receivers had been retrofitted beginning in 1996, and that gave the aircraft access to both the GPS and WAAS satellite signals for navigation. The only change required to electronically hijack the aircraft was to install an electronic module capable of connecting with the outside and then overriding the programmed flight systems with new information. Activation of that module was tied to the transponder system and would be activated upon entry of the hijacked code. Brad Taylor knew AA-11 was firmly under control of the new flight path data. Instead of flying a direct westward flight path across New York State, AA-11 was to fly a more northerly westward flight path toward Albany, New York. At that point, it would make an abrupt 100-degree turn to enter the southbound virtual tunnel that would end at waypoint Twin Towers. After the turn just northwest of Albany, it was a straight shot to the target. United 175's flight was way more complex. The standard flight took United 175 through a virtual tunnel, moving away from Boston southwesterly. It would pass over south-central Massachusetts, the northwest corner of Connecticut, over South New York State and North New Jersey. Just past Newark, in North New Jersey, United 175 would normally pick up the westward virtual tunnel that it would take to California. However, on this day, United 175 would leave its designated flight path. Having already flown southwest of New York City and Newark, the aircraft would need to reverse course to attack the Twin Towers from the south. The aircraft would make a 90-degree turn to the southeast, flying over the far eastern edge of Pennsylvania. As it crossed from Pennsylvania back into New Jersey, the plane would make another 90-degree turn and head directly for New York and waypoint Twin Towers. Brad Taylor thought it would never make its target. It had to fly through one of the world's busiest air corridors. The succession of its mission lay with all the airline pilots flying in the same space, who would have to avoid a collision with United 175. The final moments of each airliner's flight path were controlled beyond just the wayward location. AA-11 was to hit the North Tower. United 175 was to hit the South Tower. To limit damage from each crash on the tower it hit, the target was the middle of the tower. This was to be truly precision bombing. With clear skies and maximum satellite coverage, Taylor estimated that they had a better chance of success than he had thought possible. Taylor knew United 175 had just taken off, 16 minutes late. He immediately knew there was a bizarre possible problem. AA-11 had taken off 14 minutes late. Those 2 minutes could doom the entire operation. Ken Reed was the computer technician sitting next to Taylor and creator of the software program. Taylor had Reed do the calculations. Sure enough, there could be a problem. The Stewart Air Force Base waypoint was an intersection of United 175's normal flight path over New York. It was also a waypoint for the altered flight plan of AA-11. Both planes were going to cross that intersection at 8:36. Normally, ground controllers could control the space between planes by altitude and speed differences. But when the hijack code was entered by the pilot and the new data was uploaded, the transponder code for the aircraft would be turned off. The ground would not have altitude and speed information to use in avoiding a collision. Original planning had determined to kill the transponder. The lack of transponder signal was to thwart Air Force jets responding to events from having accurate positions on the attack planes. AA-11 was already not sending the transponder signal. At any moment, United 175 could be hijacked, and its transponder code would also disappear from radioscopes. Taylor realized the lack of transponder codes could be fatal to the mission. To Reed, he asked, "Can you add a transponder code to the United database?" Reed, already under enormous stress, snapped, "Codes were not going to matter. They matter now. Could you do it?" Reed did not answer. He was already into United flight software and desperately trying to add a transponder code. It would not be the one used for the plane, but there would be something to help ground controllers. Taylor waited and watched and saw 8:36, moments away. Ken Reed was not going to make the change in time. But United was still flying normally. At least that plane's altitude and speed were being seen by the ground. Taylor would later find out that the radar blips on ground radar screens from each plane merged as the two planes flew over Stewart. It was another 10 minutes before United 175's pilot entered the hijack code. By the time new flight data was transferred to the aircraft, Reed's addition of a transponder code was included. Ground controllers saw a change in transponder code by United 175 at 8:47. At first the transponder was turned off. 30 seconds later they saw another code from the aircraft. And a minute after that it went off again, and a third code came up. Reed had not gotten the software perfect, but Taylor did not care. He hoped any transponder code would aid ground controllers in getting aircraft out of the way of United 175, which was now flying itself. Taylor's calm voice notified James Morris, "United 175 is in our control." By the time Taylor reported to Morris, AA-11 had already hit the North Tower. James Morris had been waiting 47 minutes to see AA-11 crash into the North Tower. He desperately wanted to go into the street and watch it live. But Morris was a good soldier and simply awaited the attack. It was a perfect flight. AA-11 hit the middle of the tower. While Morris looked at the readout of the many thousands of sensors throughout the tower relaying the damage, he heard Taylor's confirmation that United 175 had a new flight plan. Morris soon confirmed the North Tower's integrity. Morris knew there was no danger of the North Tower requiring him to activate the fail-safe demolition. One down, one to go, he thought. Morris walked over and pushed on a circuit breaker. A line of televisions came on. The various morning news programs were being carried, including CNN. It was CNN that showed the first video of the burning North Tower. As he answered the non-stop calls coming over the radio system to him, Morris watched the televisions. He was only one of a small group of men who knew what was about to happen. When he saw United 175 crash into the South Tower, Morris immediately knew it was not a direct strike. It did not take long for the new set of sensor data to tell him that there might be a drastic problem. United 175 had plowed through the corner of the tower. The outer silo had been breached in 2 places. Morris thought, "This doesn't look good." The volume of the televisions was off, and it was only by looking at them that he saw images of the Pentagon burning. Morris knew, of course, the towers was just 2 of the targets. As he was not directly involved with anything other than New York, Brad Taylor had not kept Morris abreast of the other attacks. Morris could do nothing but watch the sensor output for the South Tower. After 45 minutes, it was clear. The South Tower had been hit between the 77th and 85th floors. The outer silo was failing. It was only a matter of time before the top of the tower began collapsing at the point of impact. The upper floors of the 110-story structure would begin tilting until gravity and the weight of the upper floors caused a massive failure. Morris knew the top of the building was essentially going to slide off. James Morris had his own version of Taylor's computer expert, Ken Reed. Ron Peterson had been with Morris since the day began. Morris had earlier directed Peterson to set the first charges under the 84th in a sequence to stand up the upper floors. Once it was righted, set the higher floor sequence to go off, and then the floor below 78. Peterson had just confirmed the resequencing was complete. Morris replied, "We have to wait as long as we can to give those in the building time to escape." Jimmy had seen television images of jumpers who made the last decision of their lives. He was stunned at the impact that the visions had on him. For the first time, Jimmy was thinking of people as more than collateral damage. "Just make sure everything is set to go upon command." It was 9:57 when Peterson said, "Sir?" "What?" Morris snapped as he looked at the video monitor. Jimmy could not immediately understand what he was seeing. "It's gone. The link is down," Peterson said hurriedly. "What do you mean it's gone?" Morris said, but needed no explanation. "The data readout of the sensors is frozen. Get it back." "I'm trying," Peterson said, with panic lacing his words. Jimmy was imagining the top of the building continuing its lean, which was probably accelerating by now. Out loud he said, "Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!" He realized what it was saying and stopped mouthing the words, but they kept replaying over and over in his mind. Jimmy thought, "I'm not even sure there is a God." But still, the repeating phrase was silently raging in his mind. All he could do was watch Peterson attempting to reconnect to the demolition system and sensors. For 2 agonizing minutes, Morris watched the computer screen. Then he heard something that made him look to the televisions. He silently watched as the South Tower exploded. It looked like a perfect demolition. Peterson did not look up from the computer screen until he heard a roar. "What the hell?" he said as he looked at the televisions. It took him a few moments before he asked, "Where's 2? What the hell happened to 2? Jimmy was so stunned his voice was calm as he asked, "Did you order the destruct?" "No, sir," Peterson mumbled. "Well, I don't think so. No, sir. I didn't do anything." "What happened?" Peterson had not seen the tower explode because he was still looking into the computer monitor. Jimmy replied, "It was demolished. It was perfectly demolished." "But how, sir?" I don't know. I think we just got extraordinarily lucky. Did we lose electricity? Peterson asked. Should not have mattered. Jimmy knew any loss of the electric grid would not affect his system. They had UPS power backup that would have kicked in without them even seeing a flicker. The only way that they would have lost the feed was if something else had happened. Jimmy was running through every scenario he could imagine. The system had numerous redundant backups, and there was no way this could have happened without some extraordinary interference. Sir, I cannot access the North Tower links either. Morris was not happy, but not panicked. The North Tower had not been damaged enough to require demolition. Still, he ordered, "Get it up." For the next 29 minutes, Peterson frantically tried to bring up the system for the North Tower. Morris continually talked on the radio to the few people who were still able to call. Morris was trying to figure out how he had lost his links. Jimmy finally found himself watching the various television depictions of the horror outside. Building 7 was separated from the Twin Towers only by Vesey Street. He did not have immediate access to any window and could only see the massive cloud debris outside Building 7 on TV. It struck him something was odd about the debris cloud, but he could not put his finger on what it was, except it was larger than anything he'd ever seen before. Granted, he had never demolished anything nearly as big as the tower. Still, there seemed to be just too much cloud, and it seemed to be growing larger. He studied each television and the various views they presented. He did not have sound on any of them, and Jimmy kept looking, studying the images. It just did not look right. He thought about going to look out a window, and for some reason that scared him. The fact James Morris was feeling fear was an odd thing. Oh, he had felt fear before, but for some definable reason, like a car out of control. But this was being scared of what? A debris cloud? No, he thought. It's more than that. It's because I don't know why the demolition sequence was initiated. He was looking at the cloud and not the one standing tower on the televisions. In an instant, the television screen he was studying showed a fountain, a huge fountain. It took Jimmy a moment to understand the fountain was where the North Tower had been a moment before. He also realized he was hearing another terrible rumble. When Jimmy finally comprehended what had happened, his legs became weak. He grabbed the edge of the desk and managed to secure himself in a chair. Ron Peterson also heard the rumble and looked at the televisions. He was now the one softly saying, "Oh my God." Peterson watched for a couple of minutes before asking, "Sir, how did that happen?" Jimmy's mind had stopped computing. He was absolutely stunned. For the first time in his life, James Morris felt paralyzed by fear. He watched Ron Peterson get up and go over to the CNN television and turn up the volume. Jimmy just sat there listening to the sounds. He could not access what the television words were conveying. Jimmy heard something else. Brad Taylor was speaking through the wireless earpiece. "Sir, are you all right?" Taylor had repeated the question a few times before Jimmy acknowledged, "Fine." But James Morris was definitely not fine. The fire alarms were ringing. Building 7 was on fire from debris falling from the north tower. "Boss, we gotta get out of here," Peterson yelled. Morris replied, "We can't just leave. The damn computer system's all locked up, sir. We don't know how bad the fire is. We gotta get out of here." Jimmy wasn't thinking clearly and just followed Peterson's lead. They left and locked the office and proceeded down a back stairway that only their office could access. They went down 18 stories before there was another door, which opened at the lobby floor. A quick right turn, and they were at the outside door. Peterson was in front of Jimmy. As Peterson opened the door, Jimmy hesitated. He could see the debris cloud, which did not rush into the door opening. The cloud was just there, churning. Peterson was holding the door open and yelling, "Come on, let's go!" At that moment, a figure emerged out of the cloud and pushed Peterson back forcefully. Peterson hit the wall. The door slammed shut behind the man who had just entered. It took Jimmy a moment to realize the dust-covered man was in a fireman's uniform. His helmet gave him away. The man's dust-white face was dominated by the wide red eyes. "Don't go out there," the fireman shouted. "It will get you. Don't go out there." Peterson yelled back, "The building is on fire. We have to get out." The fireman again pushed Peterson back. No, you'll disappear. It's gonna take you. Don't go out there." Peterson was stunned into inaction. Jimmy noticed the dusty powder on the fireman's face was beginning to show streaks. "He's crying," Jimmy thought. Please don't go out there." Peterson kindly asked, "What are you afraid of?" "The cloud!" the fireman screamed, looking over his shoulder as if something was chasing him. "It's just a debris cloud. There's nothing to be afraid of." Peterson could not get past the fireman who was blocking his exit. "It's cold," the fireman said. "It shouldn't be cold." "What's cold?" "The cloud. It's cold." "Why is it cold?" Peterson looked back at Morris, looking for help. Jimmy did not want to go out into the cloud. He had already been fearful of it for no apparent reason. Now a fireman was telling Jimmy it was dangerous, and Jimmy was not about to argue. Jimmy reached out and put his hand on the fireman's shoulder. "What happened to you?" The fireman began staring intently into Jimmy's eyes, as if he could send the images in his mind into Jimmy's mind. "We were in the lobby of the tower." Jimmy asked, "Which tower?" "Ah, the north tower. You know, the south tower blew up. Did you see the south tower blow up?" "I didn't see it. We were low in the other tower. We heard it, though, and the radio said it was gone, and we didn't know what had happened, but we kept looking for everyone who needed help, and we didn't know the other tower was going to fall, and we heard some explosions, and we just started running and trying to get to the street, and I was following the other guys, and the cloud suddenly was there, and they just disappeared." The fireman reached out and had Jimmy by the shoulders. "I know this sounds crazy, but I'm telling you, those guys just disappeared into the cloud, and the cloud was cold, and I couldn't find them, and I just started running again, and then I saw this light in the door, and now you're here, and you can't go out there or you'll disappear too." Jimmy said to Peterson, "Let's just stay here. We're right next to the door, and if the fire's bad enough, we're only a doorway away from safety. But that cloud's dangerous. It's full of asbestos and crap. We don't want to breathe it." Peterson would not have argued with James Morris for any reason. If Morris said stay, he would stay. The fireman started sobbing. Thank you, over and over again as he slowly sat down on the floor. When he realized he was still right next to the door, he got on his knees and he started studying the edges of the door, saying, "Oh, yes, no cracks. It can't get in. Yes, we'll be safe. We'll be safe." Jimmy awoke with the sound of the phone ringing. It was Brad Taylor, and he reported, "Sir, we have not been able to confirm the occupants of the Cherokee. They have exited the highway and are moving toward Pittsburgh. They may regain the highway and enter our target zone, but I don't think the window will hold." Jimmy wondered out loud, "What's in Pittsburgh?" "The airport, sir." "Confirm they're going to the airport. Do you want ground support?" Jimmy hesitated before saying, "No." After hanging up, Jimmy dialed a number. When the voice answered, Jimmy ordered, "Need you to take the chopper on a mission. Get here ASAP." "And I'll meet you at the hangar." Jimmy dialed another number and repeated the order with the addition of, "Bring the team." Jimmy went over to the computer and pulled up a file of contacts. This was the list of civilians comprising the silent stormtroopers. This was how his group could operate all over the United States quickly. When they had to get someplace, they normally flew, and would always need local ground transportation. Jimmy contacted the locals, who would make sure a car was available to his team. "Make sure it's an SUV," he said over the phone. After hearing the response, Jimmy laughed. "Yeah, okay, make it a black one." Nellie was still driving, but her co-pilot was now Marty. Sid was asleep in the back seat. For most of the time, Marty and Nellie listened to a talk radio show they had luckily picked up, but it was fading. Marty commented, "Guess we better change the channel." He finally settled on a country station. "Okay? Not my preference, but the signal's strong." "Yeah, you hungry?" Marty was surveying the back seat and knew he could get the cooler without disturbing Sid. "Yes, I am," Nellie replied. Marty retrieved some ham sandwiches and poured each of them a cup of coffee from the thermos they had earlier taken out of the cooler. It was a welcome meal. Having finished the sandwich, Nellie said, "Boy, I needed that. I didn't realize I was that hungry." "I know what you mean." They traveled for a few miles before Marty said, "Nell, you know I love you, don't you?" The question seemed odd to Nellie. She and Marty were very close, and she did love him as a friend. "Love you too. I just want you to know something that might piss you off. Just remember I love you, okay?" Nellie stole a glance at Marty and just nodded affirmatively. "It's true you found me from the website, and you were the one to send me the first email, remember?" "Yes, I remember." "The reason I made the effort to actually meet you was because of your mother." "What?" "As odd as it seems, your mom is part of the organization. Did she ever introduce you to a guy named Curtis?" "Curtis? You know Curtis?" "Yes. Curtis was the one of the first to scream about the Oklahoma bombing conspiracy, and then 9/11. I honestly don't know what brought them together, but something did. I think they were dating for a while." "They were." "Well, everyone like yourself, who seemed really motivated to find the truth about 9/11 and contacted me, was a potential soldier in Curtis's mind. He's much more militant than I am, and much more paranoid. I know there's something wrong, but Curtis sees dark and sinister men behind everything that goes down. He made the connection to you and your mother. He asked me to find out how real you are. I met with others Curtis also thought had potential, and some of them joined up. Most were just good people who knew something was not right. They did not have what Curtis called heart guts. What's that mean? Nellie asked. Heart gut indicates a dedication to truth beyond almost everything. It requires a degree of obsession. And do I have heart guts? No, not really for Curtis's purposes. I actually think your mom told him you could not make the cut. But she may have just wanted you to not get involved. That's why I've never told you this before. Truth is, I don't want you to get tangled up in the paranoia that permeates our lives. So, why have you kept in touch with me? Because I love you. You're just the easiest person to be around. I think of you as an oasis in my really crazy world. You listen to my stories and don't get weirded out by them. I can be myself and not be afraid of ridicule. And at the same time, you're living a normal life, a stable life. You seem able to bridge the gap between what most consider reality and those who think reality is a delusion. My mother. Your mother. My mom is part of your gang? Marty laughed. No, she is or was part of Curtis's world, not mine. And she may be radical, but she's not reckless. She probably had too much to lose as a college professor and distanced herself from Curtis. They seem to have had some differences, and Curtis is almost too out there, even for me. To be honest, he drinks way too much. Yeah, I noticed that. I only met him once. I thought he was, well, let's say he just wasn't my kind of guy. I wondered what she saw in him. Why are you telling me this now? I don't want there to be any secrets between us. Nellie simply said, we need to make another pit stop soon and top off the gas tank. You okay? Marty asked with concern. Yes, just processing. Marty, it's fine, don't worry. I treasure you too. It's just I need to process this information. There was an immediate shift in their relationship. The silence was kept for the next 3 miles when they exited. They decided not to wake Sid for a bathroom break. It was 15 minutes before they again were traveling I-81. Sid was still in the back, but now Marty was driving. Nellie had taken the blanket from the back seat, and Sid was not using it, so she rolled it up to make a pillow and was getting herself settled. Hope you don't mind, Marty, but I just need to close my eyes for a bit. Not a problem, Marty replied. Nellie closed her eyes, but her mind was spinning. Her first thoughts were of Shelley. The website company was set up to be run mostly through email contacts. The business telephone could be transferred to either of the partners' phones. Because of Sid's visit, Shelley was on phone duty. Nellie was sure Shelley would be wondering where she was, and by tomorrow Nellie had to make some kind of contact. Nellie had thought of Shelley not because of their business, but because Shelley was just getting over her divorce. Shelley's marriage had seemed so very perfect, until her husband found someone else to be with. Nellie had felt Shelley's pain and loss. It was, of course, Marty's admission of knowing Curtis that made Nellie focus on Shelley and her husband's betrayal. Nellie felt Marty had been deceitful and all her trust issues had come into play. It just seemed that Any time romantic love came into anyone's life, it would end in someone breaking promises. Even her mom and dad had broken their marriage vows with their divorce. Nellie had gone through a few flirtatious relationships during high school and the first year of college. In her sophomore year, Nellie found Bill and fell deeply in love during the remaining 3 years of college. Nellie had grown to assume that they would be married and have that happily ever after ending. But after college, Bill got a job, and his career began demanding more and more of his time. Nellie was totally devastated when she realized all that time had not been for work. A woman named Ellen had stolen Bill away. Nellie bought Barney the street dog home to fill the void in her heart. With Barney, Nellie did not need anyone else, or so she kept reminding herself. And with challenges of building a successful company, Nellie really did not have the time to obsess with finding a mate. But Barney had died the summer of 9/11. His passing was so very difficult because he had lived to become a very old dog. During those last months, Nellie lived with the daily realization she was going to be without her devoted companion. She still missed him more than she thought possible. She still could not adopt another four-legged, as her dad had called all animals. Losing them was just too difficult. And Marty was not someone Nellie considered having a romantic potential. He was a great guy and amazingly interesting. But Nellie honestly was settled into living alone and running the business. In the last few months, Nellie had begun thinking about writing a novel. If she had the choice of a love affair and having time to write, Nellie would choose the writing. She already knew what the ending of any love affair would be. Now suddenly Marty had, in one swift move, brought thoughts of a romantic relationship with him, right along with the issues of trust. Instead of continuing her ponderings and the emotional impact that they were having, Nellie let sleep take over her mind. It had not taken long for Nellie to fall asleep beside Marty. He was glad she was sleeping, as she had felt the awkwardness between them. At least now, that was not a problem. Marty had not expected the reaction he got from Nellie. In telling her about Curtis and her mom, he had hoped he could use it as an introduction to what he had planned. Curtis had a much better organization group with massive stockpiles of everything from bullets to food, and even seeds for growing food. While Marty suspected Curtis had a number of compounds, they were supposed to go to the one in North Carolina. It was the only place Marty thought they could find safety. Marty had lots of girlfriends. Just that, girlfriends. He had never found anyone he could actually share a love affair. Nellie was not the first girlfriend with whom he had thought there could be a possible heart connection, but he had thought Nellie might really be the one. Now he was afraid that he had destroyed that possibility. Marty was bummed out and did not have a clue how to make things right. It was now dark, and Marty thought the North Carolina border was about 20 miles away. He reached over and touched Nellie on the shoulder, while gently calling her name. Nellie woke and looked at him dazed as she tried to figure out where she was. As soon as she recognized Marty in the dark car, Nellie came abruptly awake. What We're running out of Virginia, and I'm not sure what you guys got planned." They woke up Sid when they were off the road and in front of a local Damascus, Virginia restaurant, close to the Tennessee state line. While they ate, they planned. They decided to go to Crystal's motel in Mountain City, North Carolina. Marty asked, "Who's Crystal?" Sid answered, "Sarah's best friend. Crystal owns a motel for tourists at the Cherokee National Forest. I think she can get Sarah down from the cabin on some pretext, and if anyone's monitoring Sarah's phone or actually watching the place, it might be safe. I hate to drag Crystal into this, but I don't know what else to do." "Dad, Crystal would be upset if you didn't go to her for help." "Yeah, you're probably right," Sid said, smiling. Nellie looked at Marty and explained, "In addition to running the motel, Crystal is a metaphysician and into things like natural healing, gemstones, and tarot card readings. What I find amazing is her name. She has a crystal collection that's unbelievable, and of course, she's named Crystal. But she got her name from her mother, who watched a soap opera where one of the characters was named Crystal. You're going to love her." With the word love, Nellie and Marty looked away from each other. Sid did not miss the exchange. He wondered what had happened while he'd been sleeping. The three men had sat on the ground floor beside the door of Building 7 for almost an hour before Ron Peterson left to explore. Jimmy talked to the fireman while waiting Peterson's return. It was clear the fireman thought he'd seen the men in front of him do more than just disappear. According to the fireman, the men had simply evaporated. He claimed that while the cloud was permeating the lower portion of what had been the North Tower, he could still see through it. The fireman described what he saw as the same thing that would happen to characters on Star Trek. You know what I mean? When they would get into that transporter and creep sounds would play while the transporter demolecularized them, or whatever they call it. Then they would rematerialize it wherever they were going. It was like that. It wasn't like they ran into the cloud and the cloud was so thick that I couldn't see through it. They just vanished, and I could still see beyond the cloud. Oh, man, I know this sounds crazy, but I know what I saw." Morris offered, "Maybe you'll find out they're okay. Maybe after you get out of here, you'll find them safe." "No, sir, that's not going to happen. I just know that's not going to happen." Peterson was back and explaining, "There's a bunch of people in the lobby. Rescue personnel are with them. I think we should go talk with them." It took some prodding to get the fireman to leave his safe place, and upon getting to the lobby, the three men again waited with the others who were all hoping the cloud would disperse enough for a semi-safe exit into it. But the cloud just kept getting thicker. It was hours before Morris had made contact with anyone of authority. He was actually approached by a large man asking him, "Are you James Morris?" "Yes." "Taylor sent me." Morris was safe, but the building was not. It was really in no danger of collapse, but it held too many secrets. The order was given to pull it, which was a term used to initiate a controlled demolition. At 5:20, Building 7 was destroyed, and its remains hauled away and melted down before any inspection could be made. No one would find a frozen computer in a command center on a floor that was supposed to be vacant. Day 2, Mountain City, North Carolina. Crystal had taken over running her parents' motel facilities when they retired. It had 15 guest rooms and a small pool. Most of the profit came from the gas station and convenience store, also on the property. The small gift shop was really more of a rock and a metaphysical store, which was what Crystal was really into. She was watching television when she saw the white car drive up. Dang, I'm going to miss the end, she thought as she turned off the TV. She watched the driver get out, and her mouth dropped. Damn, she said aloud when recognizing Sid. She rushed outside. Sid Morris, what a surprise! Crystal looked into the car when asking, Is Sarah with you? A woman was getting out of the back of the car, and Crystal heard her say, No, Crystal, but I am. Oh, my goodness, Nellie! Oh, wow! Does Sarah know you're here? The women hugged. Sid replied, No, Sarah doesn't know we're here. Crystal, we need your help. Crystal stopped hugging Nellie, but still had her arm around her. In response to Sid's statement, Crystal asked, This is about 9/11, isn't it? Sid had to laugh and reply, Your psychic intuition seems to be working well. Crystal was clearly very serious when replying, I'm so glad you're here. You may need help, but so does Sarah. But she can tell you all that. What do you need from me? Marty was standing outside the car, and Crystal whispered to Nellie, New boyfriend? Nellie said, Crystal, this is Marty, and a very good friend. Nellie accentuated the word friend. Marty come over and put his hand out to shake Crystal's hand. So nice to meet you. What's with the hand? Crystal said while letting Nellie go. Give me a hug. Marty gave her that hug, and he realized that Crystal was just full of heart. She felt things were going to be okay. Sid was saying, First we need to get a couple of rooms, if you have 'em. Yes, although they're not adjacent. Not a problem. And have you eaten? Yes, we're fine. Come on, let's get a couple of keys and you can get comfortable. Crystal was already heading for the office. She stopped and said to the group, Park the car over there, and she pointed. Marty said, I'll get it, Sid, and he moved into the driver's seat of the Taurus. Nellie started walking to where Marty would be parking the car. Sid followed Crystal. Who's chasing you? She asked. Sid quickly surmised the last day's adventure, as Crystal got the keys and they made their way over to where the car was parked. He was saying, So we're afraid Sarah might be watched and could be in trouble herself, if they can't get us. Crystal was soon opening the door to the first room. She turned on the light, and they went into the second room a few doors away. I'll call her and tell her that Randy, that's my dog if you remember, has a problem, and she should come down here to help me. Actually, I'll have her go to my house, and you and I meet her there. She would know Randy would not be there. He likes to take long walks, if you know what I mean. So I keep him at home behind a fence. The door to the second room was unlocked, and the light turned on there, too. Crystal was leading Sid back toward the office and stopped to give Nellie both keys. Marty said, Sid, why don't you hold on to the car keys? Marty handed him over. Crystal was scheming as they walked and thinking out loud. I'll have her bring Duke with her. Crystal suddenly stopped and turned to look at Sid. You probably don't know Sarah had to have Meg put down a couple of weeks ago. There was nothing else to it. It was her liver. I'm so sorry, Sid. The news stunned Sid. The two German shepherds had been brother and sister, and he'd had 'em since they were pups. Sid was full of sorrow, and his eyes filled with tears. Crystal hugged him, and they stood outside the office, hugging while Sid let the news sink in. Finally, Crystal continued into the office, saying, "And Sarah has to have her laptop with her." Sid was grateful. Crystal was just pushing on and pushing him back into moving on. Why the laptop? Sarah found out something concerning 9/11 that you need to know. A moment later, Crystal knew what to say. "I'll tell her to bring the laptop so we can go online and check out the veterinarian health website." Yeah, that sounds plausible. And that's the way Sarah and Duke were brought down from the cabin to Crystal's small house, only minutes from the motel. Sid and Crystal drove there in her car. While they waited, Crystal brewed a pot of coffee, and Sid became increasingly nervous. Crystal finally said, "Here she is," and went outside to greet Sarah. Sid stood up, but he did not go out. As Sarah got out of the car with Duke right behind her, she asked, "What's happening with Randy?" Crystal was giving her a hug while saying, "Sorry I lied to you. Sid's here." "What?" "He's here, and Nellie is at the motel with her boyfriend. Get your laptop." "What boyfriend?" Sarah asked while retrieving the computer. Crystal ignored the question as she led the way back into the house. They have a story to tell. Randy was at the door, excited, and Duke was being the gentleman he was. But once the door was open, the dogs were all over each other, sniffing and saying hello. Sarah looked across the dog commotion to see Sid standing and looking nervous. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he replied. When Duke heard Sid's voice, he ran over and started whimpering, even though his tail was wagging forcefully. Sid kneeled down and just hugged his old friend. Sarah said, "Sid, Meg." Sid stopped her by saying, "Crystal told me. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Forgive me." "Nothing to forgive." Sarah had tears in her eyes, and she looked at Sid's own tear-filled eyes. It was mutual when they walked toward each other and hugged. As was her way, Crystal just pushed on. She began giving a synopsis of what had happened and was happening. She explained Sid's situation as they finally are on his trail and Nellie's with him, so she's being hunted too. They were afraid you were in trouble, and they don't have any clue as to how true that could be. Then Crystal said, "And Sid, you need to sit down with Sarah and her laptop, because even without you, she probably has stumbled onto something that could get her into trouble. I need to go back to the motel, but help yourselves to the coffee." Sid replied, "Thanks, Crystal." Sid went to get the coffee. Duke followed him, with Randy following Duke. While he managed to get the 2 cups of coffee ready, the dogs were playfully underfoot. Sid opened the back door and they ran out into the fenced yard. As he entered the living room, Sarah asked, "Someone's tried to kill you both?" "Long story, but we owe our lives to Marty. He killed the guy who was trying to kill us." "How?" "He'd gotten worried and he came over to Nell's apartment like at 3 in the morning. He saw someone enter the building and decided to check it out. He found a guy messing with the kitchen stove, which would have caused a fire. By that time, both Nell and I were drugged out by some sort of aerosol gas. Marty got blessed and shot the guy in the eye. If it hadn't been for that lucky shot—" Sid's voice trailed off. Sarah jumped in. "I don't need to hear any more." Sarah had set the laptop up on the coffee table, and the two sat close together on the couch. As she was opening the computer, Sarah asked, "What's with Nellie and a boyfriend?" Sid laughed. "They'll both just say that they're friends, but I see it growing into much more. It's neat to see, and Marty, that's his name, Marty Martin, is a really nice guy. You're gonna like him. Marty Martin? Like Martin Martin? Yes. Like him already, Sarah said. Okay, let's see. Her fingers were commanding the computer to give up its secrets as she accessed her files on 9/11. Sarah explained, on the evening of 9/11, I saw Diane Sawyer interview a young man from California who was working as a volunteer at Ground Zero. Sawyer started asking about any fires still burning. The only thing he said was still burning were cars in front of the North Tower. He said they were twisted and melted into nothing. That visual he described stuck in my mind. I wondered why there would be cars burning that late after the fact. Then Sarah looked at Sid and continued, Well, do you remember Karen Arnold, my college friend? Of course. Well, she told me her father's car had been destroyed in 9/11, but the strange thing was the car was on FDR Drive. Sid interrupted her. Wow! FDR has to be 7 blocks from the towers. How the hell was his car involved? That's the problem. FDR is a good half-mile away. What destroyed it? Karen said her father couldn't explain it. He said the car looked like it had caught on fire and simply melted. In fact, he said the cars along the street in the same area his was parked all looked the same, like they'd melted. But what freaked him out was the fact that the interior of the car was untouched. Now get this. The car was so badly damaged, the engine had completely disappeared, but the car seats were basically untouched, except for dust and soot. Well, that started me looking for every photo I could get on damaged vehicles. Let me show you that. Sarah opened a file and the first photograph popped up. Sid was looking at the front of a vehicle of some sort that had incurred a massive fire. It was mostly blue-gray, except for one small section of bright red paint on the bottom front panel, and on the central part of the front wheel rim. Sarah explained, While you might not be recognizing it, this is the front part of a fire truck. The red wheel rim gives it away. But look here, Sarah pointed to the right portion of the photo. There's nothing but a hole with dust like metal. Sid, that's the engine compartment. If the engine has completely been destroyed by fire, how can that bright red paint still be on the front side of the cab? And look at this. Sarah pointed at the wheel. How the hell was the tire melted like that? All righty, everyone. I'm going to have to stop right there. And I hope you're enjoying this book by Nancy Hopkins, The 9/11 Crusade. And I'll pick up again next week where we left off this week. Thanks for listening. Bye now.